Hello, hello. So, guys, thank you very much for joining us. And obviously, this is the second annual Social Justice Summit. It is a virtual summit for reasons that we all know. But I suppose also what makes it quite important is I think when we all met last year and we're talking about issues of social justice, we could not have anticipated that with this one great reset across the world that essentially amplified all the types of issues that we were talking about last year. So it's actually one of the few blessings in disguise that you can talk about when you're relating to the COVID-19 fiasco. And I think obviously the one part that resonated with me is something that ironically reminds me of the Americans. Remember when they talk about no child left behind? And I think also in relation to the theme of this year, all hands on deck to leave no one behind. This is what we know to be a reality, that we all have different starting points and we all have different positional points economically and socially. And I think the one thing that one could hope would be able to use this opportunity to do, this being the Great Reset, is to try and find out how to bridge the pre-existing gaps and the pre-existing within our different parts of our society. And of course, the one thing that we need to be able to try and figure out is how do we then say, after this pandemic has been conquered, that divide that existed, those bridges and those gaps that existed have been narrowed in some respects. And perhaps the one illustration of that will be how we eventually deal with the healthcare solution, assuming that a vaccine exists. One of the points that I'm interested in is how we're even going to design the template for how to distribute it, because of course the people that are rich will always be able to jump to the front of the queue if it becomes a question of economics. And it's now going to be a question of how do you actually solve a healthcare issue by insulating even the most vulnerable and the most marginalized from the financing question, particularly when you know that so many people do not have the finances. So I think it's going to be a great lesson for all of us. And I think it's important for us to try and start framing the conversations around that. And I think obviously this being the day that the Americans themselves, who still insist that they have the greatest democracy in the world, in spite of the glaring evidence otherwise, they still don't know who's going to be in charge. This for me was quite an opportune one to talk about politics and democracy, because from where I'm sitting, I've thought that our politics and even our democratic systems were fraying at the seams for a variety of reasons. And I think what we've seen quite interestingly over the past few months is the revisiting of the question of nationalism. And when we talk about nationalism, it's even more acute in a time where people are looking around and saying, look, I need to save myself, I need to save my family, I need to save my country first and foremost before I start thinking about other people. Now, of course, if your name is Donald Trump, that has different manifestations because you are the person who's able to invoke the Patriotic Act and say, well, if you're a company that is based in the United States and you stumble upon a vaccine, you will not sell it to anyone until you've solved the American healthcare crisis. So I think those issues are now becoming far more amplified across the international landscape, because we now have to deal with the fact that actually it may just be the politics that trumps the science. And what happens when politics trumps the science? Do we end up worse off as the world, as the globe? And I think if we are seeing the emergence of the type of leaders who are going to prioritize the politics over the science, the risk worldwide is actually even more amplified. So I thought it was quite opportune for us to be tackling these issues today. I've said enough, so I'm now going to hand over to our two resource individuals, and this is Dr. Justice Mazenge, who's a researcher at the University of Cape Town, and also Mr. Muso Wabantu Madonsela from the Tumor Foundation. Gentlemen, 10 minutes.
Thanks, Kaya. Who do you want to go first?
I'd say Justice can go first. It's all about, the pursuit of justice.
Okay. Thanks, Kaya. And thanks very much for those introductory remarks. I think they set a tone for our conversation this afternoon. I see that we are still 6 people. So that's fine. I think I will just make it a conversation then. Then I can talk through a few points. And I know you have said 10 minutes, but the program seemed to have suggested that we have 5 minutes to go through this, like 5 minutes each. So I'll just take between 5 and 10. Um, I think Kaya, you said something that is very important. When you said when a country is facing a crisis such as COVID-19, one would uh, probably expect to see the leaders or those that are in power doing everything that they can in order to save the country. In other words, you were saying when a pandemic such as COVID-19 arises, it probably is an opportunity for one to say, what can I do for my country? What can I do to save my country? Um, but unfortunately, that is not what has happened. And unfortunately, that's probably not what usually happens when crises of this nature arise. My job this afternoon is to talk through or to give a regional perspective on what has been happening, how different governments have responded to COVID-19 pandemic, and I think I would like to take it from where Kaya left to say, did actually these governments respond in such a way that it was time to save their country, or it was an opportunity for something else? Uh, my observation is that the COVID-19 pandemic was used largely, to a large extent, was used as a weapon um, to stifle democracy and consolidate hegemonic power, more than an opportunity to save the country or to save human life. There are two ways in which these governments used COVID as an opportunity or as a weapon to stifle democracy. One is that they used COVID-19 as an excuse to promulgate regulation which disproportionately undermined certain rights that are core to the existence of democracy. So, in other words, in a normal situation where there is no crisis, it would have been impossible or it would have been difficult to promulgate some of the regulations. But when COVID-19 hit the continent or hit the respective countries that I'm going to talk about, they used that as an opportunity to then promulgate these regulations, whose impact was to disproportionately undermine certain core rights. And then the other way is that they used the second way is that the attention of the regional and international community was on COVID-19. It shifted from everything else to COVID-19. So the focus of the media was COVID-19. Different world leaders were preoccupied with how to deal with the pandemic. But some of our governments took that as an opportunity to undertake certain decisions which undermine core democratic rights. So they didn't necessarily promulgate regulations, but they took certain decisions which one could call executive action, whose impact was to undermine democratic rights. So I will just quickly show how some of these rights that are core were undermined in a disproportionate way. And then I will end by suggesting what that means for social justice, not just in South Africa, but in the region. So the right to vote is one of those core democratic rights, and I won't go into detail about why, because I think I'm addressing a group of people who are already converted on that particular point. But what has happened is that because of the threat that COVID-19 presented on human life, some governments took that as an opportunity to indefinitely postpone elections. Whilst at the same time, they would be consolidating their majority in the different levels of the legislature. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, there are about, at the time when, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there are about 30 by-elections for the National Assembly. And the way these 30 by-elections arose, or these 30 vacancies arose, is quite interesting. It's simply because the government engineered a court application, or rather the ruling party engineered a court application, which resulted in, or which rather attempted to force leadership change in the main opposition party. And following that decision of the court, the leadership that was forced upon the main opposition party began to recall from the National Assembly members of parliament. And as a result, the country now has about 30 vacancies in the National Assembly, predominantly in the opposition party, and several others at the local government level. After that, the government, and not even the Electoral Commission, the government, the Ministry of Health, then announced that the by-elections which had been scheduled for December had now been indefinitely postponed. So, which means these members of parliament who have been, or these vacancies in the National Assembly cannot be filled. But meanwhile, parliamentary business goes on, and the right to representation for individuals is undermined. Of course, the excuse is that there is COVID-19 pandemic, but if we look at Malawi and we look at Mali and we look at I think it's some parts of the Gambia and Egypt, you would see that it's possible to actually arrange and conduct by-elections without necessarily undermining public health. And the African Commission has actually issued guidelines on this particular question. And then of late, the WHO has also underscored the position that COVID-19 should not be used as an excuse to circumvent electoral democracy. The second right that I want to talk about is freedom of expression and freedom of the media, which I think is the most important right in the context of the Social Justice Summit. We have seen disproportionate assaults or disproportionate restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of the media in a number of countries. For example, in Zambia, a private TV station had its license revoked for being critical of government's COVID-19 response. In Eswatini, the Committee to Protect Journalists reported the case of an editor of a privately owned website who was arrested and charged with treason with treason for criticizing the king's government on its response to COVID-19. In Zimbabwe, the Media Institute of Southern Africa recorded 17 cases between March and August involving harassment of journalists. And some of these were arrested ostensibly for violating COVID-19 lockdown regulations. In Tanzania, some journalists had to flee to Kenya to go into exile for criticizing government's divine kind of response to COVID-19. You know that the government of Tanzania, similar to the government of Burundi, basically, did not treat the pandemic the way we treated the pandemic here in South Africa and in other countries. President Magufuli said there would be divine intervention, and so there was no need to shut down the country. In Kenya, between 12 March and 31 August, Article 19, an organization that deals with media freedom, has documented 48 incidents of violation of journalists, and these include physical assault, arrest, and verbal threats. At the end of my presentation, I will talk about what that means for social justice. But the point I'm trying to make with respect to freedom of expression and freedom of the media is that it was impermissible, even though there was a crisis, even though the different countries were going through or were at the peak of COVID-19, the pandemic. It still could not be a justification for treating journalists in the way that journalists were treated. Let me move to equality. So, one of the principles of equality is that if there is a law which is enacted and which imposes limitations, then that law must be a law of general application, which basically means that it must be applied equally on all similarly situated persons. But what we observed in a number of countries is that, or in some countries rather, is that governments would come up with restrictions on human movement and public gatherings. But these restrictions are selectively enforced. For example, in Zambia, you know that Zambia is effectively entered into an election fever because their next election is almost around the corner. I think it's coming mid or early next year. So different parties have begun campaigning and electioneering. What we observed is that the ruling party, Patriotic Front, politicians were allowed to conduct public gatherings, but civil society and opposition were not. So there was initially, before the president relaxed the restrictions, initially there was a moratorium against human movement, public gatherings, and so forth. But these rules did not seem to apply to politicians from the ruling party. We saw the same thing in Zimbabwe, where the president himself announced a lockdown in March, and the 2 days after he announced the lockdown, he conducted one of the biggest rallies. And then we saw, of course, a number of opposition and civil society activists who were demonstrating against, government policies that they were not happy with. They were arrested, and some of them are still facing charges today for violating those regulations. Now, what does this mean for social justice? I think we all know now that there's been so much corruption involved in the procurement of PPEs. And there have been other forms of corruption during this pandemic. And that corruption is not just limited to South Africa. In fact, what we are seeing in South Africa mirrors in a number of ways what we are seeing in the region, in different parts of the region. Now, by constraining the freedom of the media in the way that I have described, the authorities have been able to undermine the capacity of the media to investigate and expose the corruption. At the same time, by promulgating regulations which disproportionately undermine freedom of expression, and even by arresting some of the journalists and some of the activists on charges such as communicating falsehoods. By so doing, they have been to some extent able to intimidate those who would have wanted to speak out
Justice,
against the corruption.
Moving to the next speaker now, so if you can wrap up, please.
Yes, I'm wrapping up. So my point is that the COVID-19 pandemic has been an opportunity to sort of undermine these core democratic rights that I have talked about. And as a consequence of that, there has been a closure of democratic space in the region. And when that space is closed, citizens and groups are unable to demand transparency and accountability from government. And when we can't demand transparency and accountability from government, it is impossible, it is almost impossible to achieve social justice. I will end there for now. Thank you, Kaya.
Thank you very much, Justice, for those insights. Wandu, if you want to come in?
Well, I believe a lot of what you said, Kaya, and what Justice just said is part of what I was going to speak about. So instead, I'm going to now just focus on simply the politics aspect of things. I'm also going to be very brief to open the discussion for all of us. So to begin with, I think I'm one of those people who's going to be victim blaming. I think I'm not going to look at Africa as a whole, but here in South Africa, I believe the reason things worked the way they did under COVID was predominantly the fault of the citizens. And I think it's because of our lack of understanding of politics. And so I say this because politics, if we look at the etymology of the word, comes from the Greek word polis. And polis literally means the affairs of the city. And I've heard many a time for a person say, I don't discuss politics, I'm not involved in politics. But if we go back to what the word means, the affairs of the city, it means all of us are politicians. Some politicians hold office, but all of us are politicians, which means all of us have to be civically engaged. We need to understand what's going on and play an important part in getting to where we'd like to get. And I think I would like to read you guys just one quote quickly, which illustrates this fact. The quote is by Ezra Pound, who was an economist. So I think you, Kai, would like him best. He wrote ABC for economics. But what he says is, democracy implies that the man must take the responsibility for choosing his rulers and representatives, and for the maintenance of his own rights against the possible and probable encroachment of the government, which he has sanctioned to act for him in public matters. So this gives all the power and responsibility to the individual, to the citizen. It warns that the government will try to encroach. It's not possible, but probable that they will encroach on your civil liberties, but it becomes your own responsibility to maintain your rights when they try to do that, because they are only sanctioned to do what you've given them the authority to do. And then this leads to something that Justice said, where we speak about the powers that government has. And I'd like to just make an illustration from what Andrew Haywood does, where he speaks about the difference between power and authority. Government has power in many times, and sometimes they have authority, but power is your ability. I wrote it down here. Now I've forgotten the exact definition that Haywood said, but he says that power is one's ability to exercise, to have their will, to exercise their will over others, whereas authority is defined as one's right to exercise the will. So authority is legitimate power. So when government makes these regulations and enacts certain things or promulgates policy, as Justice spoke about, sometimes they have the power, but they don't have the authority. Authority is what we give them. But when you have an uneducated populace who doesn't know their own rights and doesn't know where they stand, then they allow certain things to happen. And so I don't necessarily disagree with everything that the president did under lockdown with the COVID regulations. But at the same time, unlike with other countries that Justice spoke about around Africa, in this country, had he tried to promulgate policy that we don't agree with, we have many organs of state which allow us to question these things. And so with certain things, Bokoko Dlamini, they might not, but that means that there are certain people who can fight for Bokoko Dlamini. So we weren't forced to adhere to all these regulations because our court system allows for us to object. And so this is why I call it victim blaming. I believe we're on a pirate ship and not a cruise ship. On a cruise ship like the Titanic, it's the captain who steers the ship and the rest of us are just in our little cabins doing our own thing with no real care about anything as long as we just get to the destination which has been decided by the captain. But on a pirate ship, all the way from the captain to the first mate to the deckhand, each and every one of them knows that they're responsible for one part of making sure the ship gets to where it needs to get to. But also they all know where it's going. They know the path. So if any time the captain dies, the first mate takes over. If the first mate dies, someone else takes over. But there's a hierarchy. But in order for there to be a hierarchy for anyone to take over, every single person on the ship knows where it's going, how to get there, and where we are at any given time. And I think with us, South Africans particularly, we're not well educated in terms of politics, in terms of democracy, and in terms of where we're going. I've heard people argue about the National Development Plan, but haven't read the National Development Plan. Here, I believe I'm victim blaming, but we can't have social justice until each and every citizen becomes actively involved. And I look forward to hearing your comments if you guys agree. But Kai, I believe you can move on.
All right, thank you very much, Wantu, for those insights. We are running out of time, so I'll go straight to Professor Bradley Slade from Stellenbosch University's Faculty of Law. Professor, your response, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Justice and Wantu, for your presentation. I am going to put some other issues on the table, and I think and then we can discuss that afterwards. So I will try and focus on theories of democracy, how it impacts certain constitutional principles, how it relates to politics, and how COVID-19 has sort of influenced how we understand politics and its interface with democracy. From my perspective, it seems relatively clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the cracks in our constitutional democracy and the way that politics play out in South Africa. The main form of democracy adopted in South Africa, namely representative democracy, appears to be the only viable but not perfect form of democracy through which we structure or mandate our government. However, representative democracy coupled with the one-party dominance has weakened a core principle which underlies democratic governance, and that is accountability. And although progress has been made towards achieving social justice, there is very little accountability with any real effect exerted over the executive arm of government in the case of corruption, in the case where service delivery are in a deplorable state, or where socioeconomic rights such as access to water, basic sanitation, housing, and healthcare are not realized, all of which contributes to the non-realization of social justice. Now, the lack on the side of the elected officials, which we mandated to hold the executive arm of government accountable in failing to realize basic human rights, which is a means to achieve social justice, has really come into stark reality during COVID-19. If one just considers the lack of medical centers, the lack of access to food, water, and so forth, basic amenities that would have been, that it was crucial for really dealing with a COVID-19 pandemic. The fact that the safeguarding and realization of rights, this is a different point, are almost exclusively channeled through the courts, as was the case in the various challenges against the executive's lockdown regulations, is for me of concern. Because I wonder what is the role of elected representatives to safeguard and realize the various rights of the people. I think their role could be a bit more prominent. A deeper issue for me with regard to representative democracy and the mandate given by the people of the Republic to the elected officials to govern society is the fact that less than half of the voting age population voted in the last national elections, which was held in 2019. That means that not even the majority of the voting age population took part in our main form of democracy as channeled through elections. A key question is therefore, how can we bring in more people to participate in elections as a manifestation of democracy, which has important consequences? It needs to be said, however, that our society regularly participates in direct and participatory democratic processes. Through demonstrations and protests, citizens highlight the prevailing inequality and lack of basic human rights. And although utilizing direct democracy as a means to enforce social justice is a necessary component of living in a free society, ideally it should not be necessary to resort to that type of democratic process as often as is currently the case. There is growing sentiment that political parties generally do not care for the plight of the people unless it is election time, and that this has a negative effect on the interest of political parties to either alone or in collaboration with others work towards achieving social justice. And perhaps we should rethink how the prevailing political system, political parties, and notions of democracy come together in order to realize aspiration in the Constitution, particularly social justice. And maybe we need to think about the responsibility of individual citizens in this regard. But I also think that there's a real concern if a voter is unable to find an ideological home in any of the political parties, and the only manner through which participation in representative democratic processes can take place is through political parties. Now, it's in this regard that a further question arises, and that is whether the decision of the Constitutional Court in New Nation Movement delivered in June 2020, which paves the way for individual candidates to contest national elections, will have any effect on accountability and the participation of voters in the democratic process. More precisely, would allowing individual candidates to contest national elections, A, ensure greater accountability of the executive arm of government, and B, entice a larger proportion of voting age population to participate in democratic processes, particularly representative democratic processes. Given our political landscape and the premium placed on political parties, it remains to be seen whether moving away from a pure form of representative democracy in national elections to a hybrid form, which allows for direct representation, will draw more people into democratic processes, such as elections, and whether a slightly amended formula for structuring national government, so one that would allow for individual candidates, will have any real consequence in ensuring accountability that could enhance social justice. So I'm going to leave it at there, Kaya. I see we only have about 10 minutes or so for discussion.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Thank you very much, Professor. I actually just want to do a follow-up on what you just said. And I think for me, this issue of the proliferation of parallel participation processes is an important one. And I think in the South African context, we tend to see, unfortunately, that the state tends to be far more responsive to violent protests, for example, which, of course, for a person sitting in a village where they haven't had water for 5 or 6 years, to then suddenly see that the people of Wuani were able to take to the streets, burn a school or two, and then suddenly the state responded, it only validates this idea that actually, if the traditional democratic process doesn't work for you, never mind, there's all these alternative systems. But even though the people that participate in them say this works much faster, this is much more responsive, it does come at the expense of the legitimacy of the democratic process that is supposed to be there. But of course, we cannot pretend that people woke up and completely abandoned democracy and simply said, we are going to go for these alternative measures. Who is responsible for restoring just the ballot box, for example, as a primary conduit of participation so that people can know that if I'm not happy with the fact that there's no water, this is how I exercise my vote in order to get those particular outcomes. Because my fear is that in the absence of us restoring that particular compact, well, of course, people are simply going to stay away from the ballot box on the understanding that if there's no water, block a road, there'll be a politician in the afternoon.
I think it may come down also to how you view these democratic processes, right? So what Wantu has said about people not being involved in politics, which is really deplorable in my mind. If you are living in a society, you are a politician, and you see the value of the different forms of democracy. So it's not only about voting once every 5 years, it's also about knowing what is your role and your rights and responsibilities within the current system. So how can you push government in the interim that may not necessarily always involve a violent or protest to ensure service delivery or realization of basic human rights.
Justice, I mean, we've now seen, and this for me was a very interesting point, that during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of governments then said, we are going to invoke a state of disaster, we're going to do this and that. And for a lot of people, the tension was, is there ever a justifiable encroachment on the type of civil liberties you and I enjoy on a daily basis versus the healthcare crisis that needed to be managed? So, of course, at some point in time, one had to take a step back and say, I understand that there's a bigger picture out there in that I may not think I'm at risk, but there are 10 or 15 other people that I'm going to be in that shopping center with might be at risk. So we all accepted that begrudgingly. But then at some point in time, people started saying, wait, hold on. Talk us through the justification of that regulation. Talk us through the justification of the banning of that, because we do not see the link between the healthcare risk you're trying to address and what it is that you're putting out there. Did governments opportunistically use the COVID-19 pandemic as a way of actually just pushing their hand?
You are reminding me of what Professor Michelle Asungule said in one of the gatherings that one of the webinars that we had on this subject. So he said, don't worry about the terminologies that are used by these governments. Some say we have declared a state of emergency. That's what the Mozambicans would tell you. And then some would say, no, we're doing a state of disaster only. That's what the Zimbabweans and the South Africans would tell you. But when you look beyond the terminologies, in the case of some of these governments, when you look beyond the terminologies, you will see that actually there is not much any substantive difference between a state of an emergency and a state of disaster, because the extent to which they are restricting the rights without any direct relationship to the need to protect public health is shocking. Now, there are standards that are supposed to be adhered to. These standards are there in the regional instruments, they are there in the international legal instruments, which all of our governments have signed up to. One important principle is the principle of proportionality, and which has been domesticated in our different legal instruments, particularly the Constitution. And this principle basically says, do not use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So in other words, don't do more harm than what is necessary. So you are right that in the case of South Africa, the people were actually trusting their government when the government started putting in place these restrictions. But it is when journalists started being hit by rubber bullets, it is when citizens started being beaten, some to the extent that they died. It is when those things started happening that then the citizens began to question. Why? Because the proportionality line had been crossed. And that is the reason why I argued earlier to say governments actually used, some of the governments actually used COVID-19 as an opportunity to do something that perhaps they've always wanted to do, which is to entrench their hegemony, to entrench their rule. And they did this by making sure, by disproportionately limiting rights as a way of incapacitating citizen agency for accountability and transparency.
Thank you very much for that, Justice. Wandu, I mean, this question of whether we were too tolerant of the state encroaching, firstly on a legitimate healthcare basis, but then later on that really turned out to be arbitrary measures. I remember the ban on the Woolies chicken. That offended me, not because I buy Woolies chicken, but because I was like, how on earth is this sensible? And quite interestingly, one of the arguments that a lot of people who were defending the regulations were saying was that, well, if we are banning somebody who sells chicken at a street corner in the township from selling it, then Woolies itself shouldn't be allowed to do so. And that for me was a problematic argument in that when you're dealing with a crisis, it's not a competition between who can and who cannot do things. And in that case, it was a matter of, well, if other people cannot do it, let us punish even the people that can do it with the type of protocols that we have in mind. So you had this bizarre situation where the chicken was a problem, but everything else within the Woolies shop could be sold.
You see, I think that's one of those situations where government encroached. It is not government's job to keep the markets balanced. But the difference where I disagree with Justice is that in South Africa, though, we have a stable democracy. We have a stable state. So regardless of the fact that those things happened, in our country, Woolworths could sue the state. And it might take some time, but the state would have to then justify in a court of law why they made such decisions. And that's because they enacted the Disaster Management Act and not a state of emergency. Had it been a state of emergency, the terminology is important. Had it been a state of emergency, they don't have to answer to us. But since it was the Disaster Management Act, for them, there are certain powers that they have which they're given by the act itself. So I think the difference with the Woolworths chicken thing, if I were Woolworths, I would have sued the state for loss of funds, because I don't think that the state had the power to do that. I don't see where in the Disaster Management Act it says you can make sure that if you're punishing the one, the other is punished too, to keep the market stable. But I think that's the benefit of South Africa over some of these other African states like Swaziland or Swaziland.
Can I interject here? Because I actually think you're wrong.
How so?
Well, essentially what happened was with pretty much all of the court challenges that were taken against the regulations, including the cigarette ban, the people who were suing government actually lost because of this thing that, there were certain interpretations of the Disaster Management Act, and the court seemed very reluctant to get involved. And I think what it highlighted was that we do have a kind of overarching dependence on the courts to remedy the wrongs or to remedy the irrationality of government, which is not always very helpful. The only time the courts really intervened against the state was in regards to the Collins Causa matter, where he was beaten to death for having alcohol in his home. But in the other matters, with regard to, the hairdressing, the cigarette ban, attempts to take on the regulations, they were unsuccessful. And, the difficulty is that litigating is very expensive. And it wasn't, the people the poor people, except in Colin Causa's matter, who have the ability to actually use litigation as a mechanism to fight things that are unlawful. And I think that's the issue. Yes, litigation is a strategy to deal with irrational decisions, but it didn't really work in regards to COVID. The cigarette ban effectively remains unchallenged. All the court rulings went against FETA and others. And, I'm not always sure that saying that, people should have gone to court is a mechanism to deal with it. The other problem is that, as you rightly point out, the difficulty is that we deal with a fundamentally unequal society. So it's about who has access to the courts, who has litigation. And some of the worst abuses that happened to people didn't happen in regards to the Woolies chicken. They happened in regards to rampant police brutality against the poorest of the poor in circumstances where it was completely unjustified. I'll shut up now.
No, see, I agree with you, but my question then was, are you saying that the judicial system as a third and independent arm of government is not independent? Because during these arguments, like with the Nando's, the Woolworths chicken and other things, legal experts would sit there, professors of law, and 5 of them sit there and they didn't have the same ideas. They argued on a basis of what powers with the disaster.
You're breaking a bit, Wantu. I don't know if it's just on my side.
Yeah, no, I also can't hear him.
Yeah, we can't hear you, sir.
Is it any better now?
Yeah. You're back on now.
So I'm saying, if legal experts could disagree, is it then not possible that the court system is independent and the judges interpreted the law the same way that the executive interpreted the law?
Look, for instance, in the FETA judgment, what I found disturbing was that the High Court, and it was judges that I respect, it was a full bench chaired by Mlambo, basically said that that the requirement on government in order to justify its decisions under the Disaster Management Act was that the aim of the particular regulation or infringement or limitation on a particular right needed to be rationally connected to the goal of saving lives. And what FETA had argued was no, that's not enough. You need to show that it is strictly necessary for this measure to be put in place. And the court rejected that argument. And I think that there was a sense in which the courts, and you see it across the board, were because COVID was something that the courts had not dealt with, we've never had anything on the scale. They didn't want to be seen to breach that separation of powers, line that they often get accused of breaching in circumstances where, their decisions could have a real impact on lives, directly so. And so it almost went into the realm of the absurd, I think, particularly on the cigarette ban case, because there was this thing that, we want to reduce the number of smokers going to hospital, but at the same time, what FETA was arguing was smokers aren't stopping smoking, they're just buying unlawful cigarettes. And the court just said, look, we believe that, there is a rational connection between the smoking ban, the ban on the sale of cigarettes and government's aim of saving lives. And that's all we're called on to determine. And that's what we're going to determine. And I think that for me was a very disturbing judgment, because I don't think it is correct. I think the government should be required to show in the circumstances that there is a sort of necessity to this. that I don't think was demonstrated in that matter. And I think that's a bit of a worrying precedent in these cases.
Yeah.
And I think our great tragedy is that as soon as we started moving across levels, then all of those court cases were abandoned without us ever getting the clarity
Exactly.
that the rationality was ever there.
The courts haven't, there's no line in the sand when it comes to the pandemic. All those rulings still stand. They set precedents. And, you know, a number of some of the more interesting ones that people were mounting around, you know, kids returning to school because there were cases on the other side. Courts didn't want to, you know, found in favor of government in terms of that. The whole workings of the public, of the Disaster Management Act and public oversight of Parliament, that wasn't heard. So there were a lot of unresolved legal issues with that, which I think, you know, disturbed me somewhat.
Yeah.
All right.
So that is one part of what we saw during the COVID-19. And I think for me, it did raise a lot of questions around, you know, issues of rationality in the exercise of public power. And I did also share the sentiment that at some points it looks like the courts were abrogating from their responsibility of actually saying, well, it still has to pass the rationality test because you're exercising public power. It is not good enough to say that there's a healthcare pandemic out there, because they still have the duty, in my view, to then interrogate every single regulation and then say, so how is this advancing the overall objective of the state? And clearly, the banning of Woolworths chicken could have never passed the test. I do not believe
Exactly.
a higher risk of dying because chicken. Professor Slade?
I have a question
Yeah, I mean,
for
can
Slade.
I just quickly respond?
Professor first and then one.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I think the courts didn't do a very good job with the rationality, proportionality questions. And I think the defense of, it's polycentric issues, they've never dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic before, it's not that great. I think, however, that they did miss the first question, that is whether or not they actually had the authority to ban certain products. So there's explicit authority in my mind to ban alcoholic beverages. There's not any authority to ban anything else. You can't, under a catch-all phrase, impose such a severe restriction on the sale of other goods. So I think the courts missed an initial question: does the minister actually have the authority to ban this or that good, before getting to proportionality or rationality questions?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Prof. 1, 2. Yeah. Question.
Question, but one of the things that Karen just said was about how a lot of things are hanging in the air. So I'm hoping you, the legal expert here, can help educate. What do we do now in terms of these things that are hanging in the air so that they don't set precedents? These court cases that were never ruled on or were ruled on but were still left hanging, what can we do now? In case there's ever another pandemic, in order to avoid the government able to do the exact same thing with the same piece of legislation, is there anything that we can now do?
Look, I think appeal is one thing that we should do, and I think we need new legislation to deal specifically with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But guys, this country takes 10 years to pass a single piece of legislation, and remember, you'd have to convince them that there's a looming pandemic somewhere in order to establish.
I know.
It's not going to happen. I do think, Professor, there's probably the reality, and I think Wantu mentioned it earlier on, in that litigation is remarkably expensive. And even when it abandoned its own case, it was on the matter of, well, who cares if we win or lose? We can now sell cigarettes. And I think it's always important for us to have the type of litigation that is in the public interest rather than in the commercial interest. Because had this been a public interest matter that had been championed by someone who actually couldn't be bothered by whether cigarettes were being sold or not, that matter would have still carried on to say, no, what I was asking has still not been resolved. I don't care whether people are selling cigarettes or not. And I think there was a missed opportunity in that we allowed those with that commercial interest to champion the cause. And of course, if the government then felt that it was getting close to, a tight spot, it would simply just resolve the commercial considerations and then say, well, what are you suing us for? And that, I suppose, is what happened in the FITA case.
Correct. Because, I think the financial consequences for FITA, in the end of the day, they are a private organization. They're going to need to justify that level of expenditure. And to say, well, we're doing this on a principle level, it's, your members would just say, well, principal's not going to pay our bills. We're already dealing with the financial consequences, and ergo we're not going to pursue this. But I do think, in terms of the litigation that was pursued by the DA on this issue of parliamentary oversight for the formulation of regulations under the Disaster Management Act was something that I need to check up, but should actually potentially be pursued, because I think the big issue, and it's been raised by everyone, is that there is an accountability deficit. I mean, there were some bizarre things. I mean, remember the crop pants incident where they were like, no, you can buy crop pants, where government was literally dictating to people what they could and could not buy for clothing. That
Only with
there's a lot of, and the difficulty is that how do you make it clear to government that while the way in which it exercises its powers is understood and respected, but it doesn't do that any good when they arbitrarily impose limitations on people who are already in a state of severe stress, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's the arbitrary exercise of power on one end, and then the excessive brutality of the police against the poorest of the poor, to try and demand some form of compliance, that were really both ends of a power dynamic that is actually unhealthy in this country.
We need to start wrapping up. I don't know if everybody would like to share final comments.
I have a question. I think Karen might be able to answer. So I'm a fan of litigation. However, now that Parliament is open, surely this is something that can be Parliament, and you ask Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, she has to answer about all the regulations, why they were necessary. That is something that Parliament can do, unless I'm mistaken. To get those answers.
There's a beautiful book, Wandu, by George Orwell, 1984. It refers to this idea of a utopia, and that's what you see existing.
No, but
the politicians in South Africa would champion a cause, even though there's no political mileage associated with it. That's a reality.
But our constitution allows. Do I have too much faith in our state and our rule of law? I know there's corruption, but certain organs of our state function besides for the politicking.
I wish we had that type of state. I do not believe we do.
Well, I guess this is why we're here, to get there.
Any other last comments, guys?
I believe not.
No. Okay. Thanks for the discussion.
Okay. Is Justice still here?
Yes, I am here.
Are you satisfied?
I'm completely satisfied. I think the point that was shared earlier on about the need for a brainstorming that focuses on pandemics, I think that is necessary. So that we become ready for the next pandemic, which I think is not too far away.
April. It's apparently going to get. My sister says that they're predicting in April we're going to have our second wave here.
Yeah. And I think you open this conversation.
I think that's such a valuable point. Is like we are looking at the potential that we're going to be in the same situation and in another lockdown. And how do we preemptively start saying, look, there needs to be a constructive engagement about how this happens, because we've been through this before. We've seen what doesn't work. How do we make it work better in the future?
So we are. And I think the final summary is that democracy and politics definitely suffered during COVID-19, and in some cases degenerated.
Definitely.
Thanks a lot, guys. We'll reconnect in the bigger group.
All right. It was wonderful to see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.